Hey, what's going on, everybody? Normally, I do this lecture on a whiteboard, so this will probably be a little different, but the information will be accurate and will take care of. This basically will take care of the place of my live version, of course. So, in part two here, what we typically do is we kind of build off of part one. And if you remember from the part one lecture, usually towards the end, we kind of review the main reasons we need ATP for skeletal muscle function. And those would be to energize the myosin head in the cross bridge cycle, to break the cross bridge so that muscles can actually relax, and then to actively transport calcium back into the terminal cisterns. And so to transition in from part one to part two, we again emphasize the necessity of ATP. So if we engage in any form of active movement for a variety of periods of time, perhaps warming up before an athletic competition, or if you're like me and you would prefer to live somewhere near the ocean, if you go for a nice casual walk on the beach and you walk for a while, that's sustained movement. And if we're going to do that, our body has to replenish ATP immediately so that muscles can continue to function the way that they are supposed to be, and we keep moving. So that's the emphasis of the first part of part two. And then, so we're going to talk about that. And then towards the end, the last couple of slides, we'll talk about differences between muscle fibers. So I'm just going to keep my view here. I'm not going to, zoom in unless I have to. So, like I said, I normally do this on a whiteboard. So let me find where we're going. All right, yeah, we're going to start here. So basically, three systems. So we have what's often called the phosphagen system, the creatine phosphate system, or the high energy phosphate system. That's the first one. And then we've got generally called glycolysis, or you can even get real specific and call it anaerobic glycolysis. And then the third system is often called the oxygen system because it's still, well, you'll see, the energy source that drives this particular system here is called creatine phosphate. It's a molecule, energy storage molecule, and then glucose predominantly drives these two here. But this particular system is anaerobic because the body chemically isn't utilizing oxygen in the formation of ATP because the demand for ATP is so high that, again, oxygen just doesn't have time. Hold on, I don't know if you guys can see this on my screen, but my son is in Disneyland right now with his band, the high school band, and he's sending me texts. So I apologize if you saw those things. Okay, so back to this. The body doesn't utilize oxygen in the formation of ATP here, but it does here. So hence the name oxygen system. All right, so with the creatine phosphate system, so again, creatine phosphate is the molecule that we use here. Our body generally has a fairly readily available supply in skeletal muscles, but here's how it works. So an enzyme called creatine kinase will split the creatine phosphate molecule down into creatine and an inorganic phosphate. And the inorganic phosphate here can be donated, kind of like we see here. The inorganic phosphate can be donated to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. For every molecule of creatine phosphate, we can get 1 ATP out of it. Now, it's a powerful system in the sense that it can replenish ATP fairly rapidly when we start moving. but it kind of craps out fairly fairly quickly. It's not very sustainable. Crapped out is not exactly a scientific way to put it, but it works. So anyway, again, this system is going to drive ATP replenishment fairly quickly, but again, not very sustainable. Okay, so what do you need to remember here? You need to remember that creatine phosphate drives this. You need to know that creatine kinase splits this molecule down into its individual components, creatine and a phosphate. You need to know that the phosphate is then donated to ADP to make ATP. Now, little side note here. You can, like I said, our bodies have a readily available supply of it. When we rest, it replenishes it. You can get it from, healthy sources of protein like red meat, but you can also supplement it in your diet with a variety of powders and creatine gummies and creatine chewable supplements, kind of like your old school Flintstone multivitamins, that powdery kind of a thing. And I even use one. It's a powder that is kind of creatine and collagen that I actually put in my coffee in the morning because I go to the gym regularly, and so creatine. There's a little bit of a misconception. A lot of people supplement creatine in their diet because they think it's going to make them bigger and faster and stronger. It doesn't do that directly. So if you go to GNC or if you go to the Vitamin Shop or wherever, buy it off of Amazon, supplement it. You can supplement it into your diet. And like I said, it's not going to make you bigger and faster and stronger. But what it will do is it will enhance recovery, whether that's during an individual workout session or between workout sessions on a rest day. And it helps make the work that you do in the gym or out on the field, if you're an athlete or on the court, it helps make it more effective. So again, it doesn't make you bigger and faster, stronger directly, but it can influence that indirectly. And like I always tell students, if you're interested in supplementing something like that into your diet and you're not sure if it's the right decision, it's always best, 100% of the time best, to ask your doctor first. And if it's hard to get into your doctor, from my experience, it's probably just as safe to ask a pharmacist, and they'll probably be fairly helpful. So anyway, just be careful, typing that kind of thing into AI or asking, don't take this the wrong way, and this is not a slam against GNC employees, but don't necessarily trust their advice. Okay, just trust me on that one. All right, so there you go. That's the creatine phosphate system. So let's find. All right, here we go. Glycolysis. So glycolysis is, if you look up the definition of that term, it's essentially we're using glucose. Okay, we're using glucose in the manufacturing of ATP. Now, it's a little more complicated than what we're going to talk about here, so we're really going to simplify it. Okay, so common sources of glucose that we pull from to make ATP are glucose in the bloodstream, so blood glucose levels, and then what's called glycogen. Glycogen, we've talked about this in the class, or in class, is, and I don't actually know a specific number here, so don't quote me on anything, but glycogen is a storage molecule made up of many glucose molecules linked together. So it's a very large sugar molecule, again, made up of many glucose molecules. So if we're going to take glycogen and use it in the process of glycolysis, essentially, let's just say for the sake of discussion that a glycogen molecule is 100 glucose molecules linked together. If we're going to take that glycogen molecule and use the glucose to make ATP, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take that chain of 100 and pull it apart one glucose molecule at a time until we have 100 individual glucose molecules to use in this process. All right, so that's essentially where we're going to get our glucose. And I believe also in this, probably in the handout somewhere here, is you want to make sure you make a note of the fact that glucose is not the only source of energy for ATP manufacturing. Our body can use amino acids from protein digestion. Our body can use triglycerides from fat digestion to make ATP. Triglycerides are actually a much, if I can say, denser supply of energy compared to glucose in terms of how much ATP we get per molecule. And I'm pretty sure that's actually in the PowerPoint here. All right, so that's where our two main sources of glucose. Now, where do we get glycogen from? Generally, our body stores glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscles so that when we need it, it can break it down and use it to make ATP. All right, so glycolysis, generally going to be anaerobic, but if you study this stuff in more depth, like if you take a sports nutrition class or an exercise physiology class, you might get into some pretty crazy depth. Now, hold on just a second. All right, back to this. Sorry, I had to pause the recording for a minute. Had a phone call that I had to take. All right. So back to this. So generally, this process is going to be anaerobic, especially early on in an activity. And anaerobic glycolysis is going to drive ATP replenishment. It could, I mean, I think this is where you're going to get into some gray, but it could drive ATP replenishment for several minutes to quite a while. I know that's very scientific, but the point is that at this point in whatever movement we're engaging in, the demand for ATP is great. It's a high demand, but this all is happening so fast that, again, the body doesn't have enough time to utilize oxygen in the chemical production of ATP. So here's what we get out of this. So number one, make sure that you know that glucose is the energy supply driving this process. So we take one glucose molecule, and since this is anaerobic, okay, and it's not requiring oxygen, we're going to take this glucose molecule, and in the process of harvesting ATP, we're going to get, we take the one glucose molecule and we're going to get 2 ATP and pyruvic acid. Some sources, like it says here, will say 2 pyruvic acid molecules. Now, on the exams, sometimes I actually will just say pyruvic acid and not refer to 2 of them. So just be aware of that. So, but the main thing here is that per molecule of glucose, we're going to get 2 ATP, and that's net, okay, because it actually takes ATP to drive this process to make ATP. So it's kind of a strange concept, but it literally takes ATP to make ATP, okay? So per molecule of glucose, we get 2 ATP and pyruvic acid. Now, consider this a pathway, okay, this anaerobic pathway. And at the end of this pathway, if the activity in question is heavily anaerobic in nature, the pyruvic acid will continue down the anaerobic pathway and become lactic acid. So as it says here in blue, lactic acid is the end product of the anaerobic pathway. Okay, so again, we take one molecule of glucose, and out of it, we get 2 ATP and pyruvic acid. And if the conditions are anaerobic in nature, the pyruvic acid will continue in the anaerobic process and become lactic acid. And generally, that's what, if any of you have ever been involved in competitive athletics, or you don't even have to be an athlete, but after an intense workout session, generally that burning and oftentimes uncomfortable feeling is usually brought about by lactic acid. However, when we rest, our body breaks down the lactic acid, converting it back into pyruvic acid, and then will ultimately make ATP out of it. So if you ever hear somebody, let's say after they had a hard workout in the morning or in the afternoon, like if you're an athlete, and the next day they're really sore and they're like, oh man, this lactic acid is killing me. I'm still sore from yesterday's workout. You can tell them that it actually has nothing to do, zero to do with lactic acid, because again, our body breaks that down once we enter an active rest period. Okay, so let's see. So that's glycolysis. All right, now if the conditions, here, yeah, I generally mention this. The Cori cycle. That's what what we call the body converting the lactic acid back into pyruvic acid. Let's see. Okay. Now, if the conditions of the activity are generally longer in duration, time-wise, and the activity is lighter intensity, again, longer duration, then we move into what's called the oxygen system, or what's called aerobic respiration. And this, as it says here, produces 95% of ATP during rest and light to moderate exercise. Okay, so our body now has the ability to use oxygen in the chemical reactions to make ATP. Now, pyruvic acid. Okay, this is the same pyruvic acid that we just talked about in glycolysis. But if the activity is, again, light to moderate intensity and longer in duration, the pyruvic acid is converted into what's called acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA, as it says here, enters the mitochondria, and through a series of reactions, you get 36 ATP, CO2, carbon dioxide, and water. Okay? Now, that is still from the original molecule of glucose that entered glycolysis. And so here's where you have to pay attention to the phrasing of the questions on my quizzes and exams, because I like to trick you. Okay, I like to trick you because I really want to see how well you're paying attention and focusing on the wording of the questions. So, if I ask you how much ATP do we get per molecule of glucose out of glycolysis, the answer is 2. If I ask you how much ATP do we get per molecule of glucose from the oxygen system, the answer would be 36. But here's where it gets a little tricky. If I were to ask you how much ATP do we get per molecule of glucose by the end of the oxygen system or the aerobic pathway, what you have to do there is you have to take into account the original 2 from glycolysis and then assume that the pyruvic acid is converted to acetyl-CoA, and it goes through this process and gives us this. So then the total would be 38. So you just have to pay attention to the phrasing of the question, okay? So don't let me trip you up, all right? It's at the time of this recording, it's not always going to be baseball season, but it's actually May 2nd right now when I'm doing this recording. And so yeah, using a baseball analogy, I'm a pitcher and I like to throw you a good knuckle curve or a knuckleball and get you to swing and miss. So don't let me strike you out, all right? Take that pitch and drive it over the wall, all right? Now, here's what I was mentioning earlier. Glucose isn't the only thing that we can use to make ATP. Fatty acids are the main fuel after 30 minutes of sustained exercise. Now, does that mean that after 30 minutes you're only burning fat? No, that was kind of a thing for a long time, not a misconception, but people would think, oh, do I have to work out for at least 30 minutes to burn fat? Not exactly. If you burn calories and weight loss is your goal, burning calories, period, is going to help with that. But the longer we work out, the body will then start to utilize other sources of energy like this. Okay, so that is a summary of the 3 energy systems that drive ATP replenishment. So remember the creatine phosphate system. We take 1 molecule of creatine phosphate and we get 1 ATP out of that. Then we go to glycolysis, where we start to use glucose. Per molecule of glucose in glycolysis, we get 2 ATP and 2 pyruvic acid molecules. If the activity in question is anaerobic in nature, remember the pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid. If the activity in question is longer duration, light to moderate intensity, the pyruvic acid is converted to acetyl-CoA, enters the mitochondria, and we're going to get 36 ATP, CO2, and water. That's just from glucose. Okay? Now, let's see. Where is the slide? Okay, yeah. I actually like to start here to kind of transition us over into muscle fibers. Don't ever let anybody tell you that rest is not important. Rest is very important. So, here's why. When we rest, okay, the oxygen reserves in our muscles are replenished. There is an oxygen-binding protein in muscle cells, similar in function to hemoglobin in our red blood cells, but it's called myoglobin. And when we rest, our body restores the oxygen concentration in myoglobin so we can use it again. When we rest, our body converts lactic acid that may have accumulated from the anaerobic activity, converting it back into pyruvic acid, and then that, over time, will go through the oxygen system and we'll get ATP out of it. When we're not using glucose for ATP harvesting, the body will store it in the form of glycogen for later use. And then, again, we're just going to make ATP and we're going to replenish our creatine phosphate stores so that once we exercise again, we have that readily available. This, it used to be called repaying the oxygen debt, but the current term is called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. All right, now, muscle fibers. Let's start to get into the last part of our discussion here. We are at a little over 22 minutes according to my timer here, and I want to be done before 30 minutes is up. All right, so muscle fibers. Generally, we all have the same type of muscle fibers. Let me rephrase that. As human beings, whether you are male or female, okay, across the globe, we all have the same types of muscle fibers. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, we all have the same types of muscle fibers. The differences come in the genetic distribution and percentages of the individual fibers. That's where our diversity really becomes cool at the muscular level. Or we can even the proper term would be the cellular level in terms of muscle cells. So, muscle fibers are named based on two main characteristics: speed of contraction. So they're either going to contract slowly or quickly. So therefore we have slow twitch fibers or fast twitch fibers. And what makes them slow or fast twitch is how much of a particular enzyme called myosin ATPase is available. If there's more of it, it splits ATP faster to drive the cross-bridge cycle to occur faster. Then we use the metabolic pathway for ATP synthesis. So if the fiber in question uses the aerobic pathway or the oxygen system, it's going to be called an oxidative fiber. If the fiber in question uses glycolysis, specifically anaerobic glycolysis, we call the fiber a glycolytic fiber. So because of these two things, we generally have three types of fibers. Slow twitch oxidative, also called type 1 or red. We have fast twitch oxidative, or 2A. And then we have fast twitch glycolytic fibers, or 2B. Those are white. Now, the color red and white depends on how much myoglobin is in that individual fiber. So when we look at them under a microscope, type 1s typically appear red because of the myoglobin concentration, whereas the 2Bs typically appear more white because of less myoglobin. Now, you can imagine if this one is red, this one is white, and the 2A is kind of a hybrid of the two, the 2As may appear a little bit more pink under a microscope. Okay? Now, a couple of important points here. All fibers in one motor unit are the same type. Now, a motor unit is generally something that I talk about in the Part 3 lecture, but let me just define it for you real quick. A motor unit is an individual somatic motor neuron and all of the fibers that it directly innervates. So let me say that one more time. A motor unit is a single somatic motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it stimulates directly. Now, in a motor unit, as it says here, all of the fibers are the same. So in any given motor unit, whether it's 2 fibers or 1,000 fibers, all of the fibers in that individual motor unit are the same. So they're either going to be all 1s, they're going to either be all 2As, or they're either going to be all 2Bs. Now, in any individual muscle, let's say the biceps brachii, the triceps brachii, pec major, or any one of the 4 quads, or any one of the 3 hamstrings, in an individual muscle, you're going to have a mixture of fiber types. So perhaps I have all 3 of these in my biceps brachii. But remember, in an individual motor unit, all of the fibers are the same. So there's a little bit, make sure you're not confused about that. All right, so one more time. In any given muscle, you're going to have a mixture of fiber types. However, in an individual motor unit, all of the fibers are the same. Now, this is where it gets super cool. Genetics dictates the individual's percentage of each, like I mentioned before. So that's why, certain people are, I don't like to use the term predisposed very often, but certain people are predisposed to potential success in particular events. I am a huge fan of the Olympics, whether that's Winter Olympics, Summer Olympics. If it's on, I'm watching it. And so I think of Olympic events. So when I think of this point here, so let's say it's the Summer Olympics, and you take your super heavyweight weightlifters. They're big people. They're strong people, man. And then you take your marathon runners, these people that can just run for days. You compare those two types of people, you put them standing next to each other, the distance runner is going to be thin. The super weightlifter, the super heavyweight, is going to be big. Now, they both are active people, but because of their body makeup, because of their genetic distribution of these individual fiber types, they're better suited for their individual types of activities. Does that mean that the marathon runner can't lift weights and can't get strong and can't bulk up? No, sure they can, but probably never to the point or the same level as the weightlifter. Can the weightlifter run and perhaps do a marathon? Absolutely. But are they going to be as successful as the Olympic elite class runner? Probably not. Okay, so it doesn't mean that you can't do something. It just means that there are limitations. There are limitations, biological limitations, and desire is not enough in some cases. Okay, so let me show you a couple things here. We're almost done. I'm not going to make my 30-minute goal. Now, the fiber type will drive different types of activities. So the type 1s, they're going to be emphasizing low-intensity endurance types of activities, like a long run, a long swim, a long bike ride, or something more practical on a daily basis. Our postural muscles are mainly type 1s because they're always working to keep us upright human beings. Your fast twitch oxidatives, your 2As, okay, your 2As and your 2Bs are going to be kind of mixing up in the intensity of the activities. Now, The 2As, yes, are going to be involved in sprinting and walking, but so are these. So are these. Okay, so that's where there's a little bit of a kind of a gray area, and the 2As can show characteristics of the two extremes. Now, let me focus on this for a second. Generally because whenever we get to this point in a lecture, what I usually tell people is that this is an essay option on the exam. And where I tell people, okay, your first part of this essay option is a description of how we name fibers. So, speed of contraction and ATP synthesis, pathway of ATP synthesis. But then I tell people, you need to know how to compare the 1 versus the 2B. So let me show you a couple things here. So the column here in the middle is the 2As, the fast twitch oxidative. You've got your 1s here and your 2Bs over here. Now make a look at this down here, because this actually is important. A little asterisk here. In animal studies, fast glycolytic fibers were found to be the largest. But this is not true in humans. Now, let's look at that for just a quick second. Fast glycolytic, so fast twitch glycolytics, they are the biggest in humans. Okay, actually. So, you know what? Can I get rid of this? No, I can't actually. Oh, no, hold on. Let me see. Let me try something here. Oh, nope, I can't. It's part of the whole thing, so I can't get rid of that. But when I was in school, we were taught that these guys were the biggest. So disregard that, okay? Now, here's what I would suggest as you're studying this material, and if you're preparing for this particular essay option, if you were to have an essay on this exam, which sometimes I put them out there, sometimes I don't, but if I did, take any 4 of these. So let's look at some of them, okay? So the speed of contraction, they are slow twitch. They're going to contract slowly. Not a lot of myosin ATPase activity, hence the speed of contraction. They are aerobic in nature, lots of myoglobin, not as much glycogen. Now, recruitment. I'm going to skip this one because that is that's a third lecture topic that we'll go into. Now, this is an important part right here. The rate of fatigue. The 1s are fatigue resistant. They don't tire very quickly. Whereas the 2Bs over here, they are fatigue prone. Okay? This row here kind of talks about some examples of activities, but let me go down here. The 1s are the smallest. They have lots of mitochondria, so really good for ATP production, very rich blood supply, and they are red in color. Now, let's compare this to this. So the 2Bs, fast contraction. Lots of myosin ATPase, which drives this. They're going to get their ATP from anaerobic glycolysis. Okay, not as much myoglobin, but a lot of glycogen. They are fatigue prone. So these guys are they're gonna peter out pretty quickly. Okay. They are the biggest of the 3. Fewer mitochondria, fewer capillaries, and white. Okay, so the biggest fibers have the greatest potential for force production. Okay, because more cross bridges equals more force. So the bigger the fiber, the stronger it can be, which is why the 2Bs are the strongest compared to the 1s. Okay, so when you're studying this material, and again, if you're preparing for this particular essay response, what I generally suggest is pick any 4 of the characteristics of the 1, and then to compare them, you take those same 4 characteristics over here in the 2B, and they're opposite. So if it's me, I'm looking right here. Speed of contraction. These contract slowly. The 1s contract slowly. The 2Bs contract quickly. The 1s are fatigue resistant. The 2Bs are fatigue prone. The 1s are small, have a smaller diameter. The 2Bs are the biggest. The 1s are red in color. The 2Bs are white in color. Look at that. 4 characteristics, a perfect compare contrast. Okay? So that about wraps it up. I missed my 30-minute mark by about 5 minutes. I apologize for that. If you have any questions, let me know.